This podcast is brought to you by Give Us Mo Entertainment.
Welcome back to the AI Analysis Podcast. Today we're talking about something that seems to be on everyone's minds, the US dollar.
It absolutely should be. I mean, we interact with it dozens of times a day, but we often forget that the money in our wallet, or now the digital number in our bank account, is really a complex historical artifact.
Yeah.
It reflects centuries of political, economic, and even, technological battles.
That's so true. The sources we've collected trace the history, function, and just this astonishing evolution of the United States dollar, the greenback. And this isn't just an accounting lesson. It's really a systematic journey to understand these foundational shifts in American economic philosophy.
And our mission today is to unpack all of that for you. We're starting with the dollar's, chaotic and uncertain origins of the colonial era.
Right.
Then we'll track its dramatic crisis-fueled rise to global reserve status through the gold standard, the Great Depression, and that abrupt shift to pure fiat currency.
And we'll wrap up by looking at its present-day mechanics, like how the Fed actually manages the money supply, the reality of its purchasing power, and some really interesting plan changes, both physical and conceptual, for its near future.
You are going to walk away with a fundamentally richer understanding of why this currency dominates the global economy and, what its changing value really means for your everyday life.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even start? I guess before the U.S. even had its own standard currency, the colonies had a huge money problem, didn't they? Relying on whatever foreign coin they could get their hands on.
That's exactly right. The concept of the dollar didn't just spring fully formed from the Constitutional Convention. Right. It was a unit that was already really familiar to the American colonists, the Spanish silver dollar.
The piece of eight.
The piece of eight. For over a century, this reliable silver coin, minted mostly in the New World Spanish territories, was, the dominant unit of trade and account across North America.
So the U.S. monetary system was kind of built on a Spanish precedent. That's a crucial detail that I think gets overlooked a lot. It really speaks to the practical need of just using what worked, what was accepted.
And that practical borrowing extends even to the famous symbol itself. The dollar sign, the dollar, was officially adopted in the U.S. in 1785, but its lineage, it traces directly to the Spanish.
How so?
It evolved from a scribal abbreviation for pesos, which was often written as IBES. Over time, the P and the A's just sort of merged and simplified into the S with one or two vertical lines that we know today.
Wow. Okay, so before the U.S. government could get its act together, the colonies were already experimenting with paper money. And it wasn't a great experiment at first.
No, it was born of sheer necessity, specifically funding the military.
Yeah.
The Massachusetts Bay Colony pioneered paper currency way back in 1690 to cover the costs of military expeditions.
So they were essentially just IOUs.
Exactly. They were colonial promissory notes. And other colonies followed, creating this really confusing patchwork of paper backed by, varying levels of local tax revenue or commodity stores. It was a mess.
And since confidence in paper was so low, they needed anti-counterfeiting measures, even back then. Which brings us to Benjamin Franklin, whose efforts in this area are just fascinating.
In 1739, Franklin's Philadelphia printing firm started producing colonial notes that had a feature he called nature prints. So instead of using standard engravings, they would press actual leaves and plants into plaster to create these unique raised metal casts.
The genius of that was its complexity, right?
That's it. Because the patterns were cast directly from nature, they had all these textures and irregularities that, a hand engraver or a woodcutter at the time simply could not replicate. It was a pre-industrial biological security feature.
Laying the groundwork for the security measures we see today.
Absolutely. But even with that ingenuity, the shift from colonial notes to a national currency was catastrophic during the fight for independence.
You're talking about the Continental currency.
Yes. When the Continental Congress authorized it in 1775, to finance the war, and we're talking about the first government-issued $2 note here, dated June 25th, 1775, they made a fatal mistake.
They just printed too much of it, way too quickly, with no clear way to back it up.
Exactly. Congress authorized over $240 million in these notes. And when you pair that with widespread counterfeiting that was actually orchestrated by the British, well, public trust just evaporated.
And the result was hyperinflation.
Total hyperinflation. By 1781, those notes were practically worthless, which is where we get that famous, painful American proverb.
Not worth a Continental.
Not worth a Continental. And that economic trauma had a profound, lasting impact on the founding generation. It really explains why, when the Constitution was drafted, the delegates were explicit, States were prohibited from issuing their own bills of credit.
So the founders were deeply skeptical of paper money, especially fiat currency.
Politically, yes, deeply skeptical. And that skepticism dictated the first major legislative step in establishing the dollar, the Coinage Act of 1792. This was under Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton.
And it was Hamilton who introduced the decimal system, which was a huge innovation at the time, right? The mill, the cent, the dime, the dollar, the eagle.
A remarkable innovation.
Right.
But the core of the act was its backing mechanism. It defined the dollar based on a fixed quantity of metal, 371.25 grains of fine silver, alongside an established gold-to-silver ratio.
Which was initially 15-1.
Correct. This established the U.S. under a system of bimetallism. The hope was that using both metals would ensure the currency was stable and, that there was enough of it.
Okay, so alongside defining the coinage, Hamilton also establishes the first Bank of the United States in 1791. Why was it so critical and why was it so controversial?
Well, Hamilton saw the need for centralized credit. He needed a powerful national institution to stabilize the banking system and issue reliable private currency Bank of the United States notes, which would trade alongside the official coins.
But the bank's very existence basically ignited the first great American monetary battle.
It really did. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. They saw the bank as an unconstitutional overreach. They feared centralized power and debt. And that political split led to the first bank's charter expiring in 1811.
So American money enters this long period of political and economic instability. The first bank dies, state banks are popping up everywhere, and this bimetallic standard is proving incredibly difficult to maintain.
Precisely. Bimetallism is great in theory, but in practice, the market price of gold and silver is constantly fluctuating. So if the market value of silver rose above that statutory 15-1 ratio, people would just melt down their silver coins for profit.
And hoard the gold instead.
Exactly. It's Gresham's law: bad money drives out good money.
This instability leads to the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, partly because of the chaos after the War of 1812, but that just reignited the war between central authority and sort of agrarian populism, right?
It did. And it all culminated in the infamous bank war during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Jackson saw the Second Bank as this elitist, monopolistic institution controlling the nation's credit.
So he vetoed the renewal of its charter.
He did in 1832. And that effectively destroyed the central banking structure for decades.
So by the 1830s, the U.S. has no central bank, and this chaotic system of state-chartered private banks issuing thousands of different, often unreliable, paper notes.
It was a decentralized mess. That free banking era lasted until the next great crisis, the Civil War. And that conflict forced the U.S. government to abandon its cautious approach and take the decisive permanent step toward national paper money.
Necessity breeds invention. When the war began in 1861, the Union needed massive funding immediately, and the answer was the creation of the greenbacks.
To finance the escalating costs, the Treasury issued non-interest-bearing demand notes in 1861. They got the nickname greenbacks because of the distinct green ink they used on the backside.
Which was an anti-counterfeiting measure to stop photographic copying.
Exactly. And crucially, these notes were initially redeemable for gold or silver upon demand. A little nod to those constitutional concerns.
But the demand for actual coin was just overwhelming, even for the Union.
Correct. The government quickly suspended specie convertibility in late 1861. Then, in 1862, Congress authorized the United States notes, or legal tender notes. And this is a critical distinction for the learner.
How so?
Unlike the initial demand notes, these were true fiat currency from the very start. They were backed only by the promise of the U.S. government. Creditors had to accept them at face value.
And they kept being called greenbacks.
Yep, the name stuck, and they circulated all the way until 1971.
But this sudden flood of new, unbacked national paper currency created an immediate problem. How do you get the public to trust it when counterfeiting is rampant?
You build a federal anti-crime agency dedicated solely to that purpose. The U.S. Secret Service was established in 1865, specifically to go after counterfeiters whose activities were undermining the stability of the new currency.
And the sources detailed just how big of a threat they were facing. Some of these counterfeiters were true artists.
Oh, absolutely. Take the case of Emanuel Ninger, known as Jim the Penman, who was arrested in 1896. He specialized in high-denomination $50 and $100 notes, which he produced using only a pen, a brush, and high-quality paper.
And they were convincing.
So convincing they would regularly pass inspection at banks. It really shows the artistic challenge that Treasury was up against.
So to combat that genius, Standardization and technical security became paramount.
By 1862, the visual foundation of modern banknotes was being standardized. Complex, fine-line engraving that was difficult to reproduce, intricate geometric lathe-work patterns, and the now familiar U.S. Treasury seal.
And that seal with the key and the scales, it's a classic piece of symbolism, isn't it? The key for authority, the scales for justice, all reflecting the government's role as guardian of the public purse.
A perfect summary.
So if the 19th century was about chaotic invention and crisis response, the 20th century was about the dollar's steady climb to global dominance. A dominance built on gold, but eventually sustained by, well, by completely abandoning it.
That's a great way to put it. By the turn of the century, the U.S. had mostly settled the question of what would back its currency. The Gold Standard Act of 1900 formally linked the dollar solely to gold, ending decades of that bimetallic wobbling.
But it wasn't an easy transition, was it? The political fight leading up to 1900 was fierce. I mean, you have the famous Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan.
Passionately arguing for the continued use of silver to aid farmers and debtors. It was basically a class war fought over monetary policy. But in the end, gold won. The 1900 Act fixed the price at $20.67 per troy ounce.
Establishing this rigid, fixed monetary system.
Right, and it was intended to prevent inflation and ensure international trust. But this fixed system needed a manager. The financial panic of 1907 really exposed the rigidity and inelasticity of a gold-backed currency.
Meaning, when people suddenly demand cash, the supply couldn't expand quickly enough.
Exactly. And that led directly to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This act established the nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve System, the Fed.
And its primary initial purpose was to provide an elastic currency, right?
Yes, so the money supply could be expanded or contracted to prevent panics and stabilize credit. Its notes, the Federal Reserve Notes, or FRNs, became the standard circulating currency we use today.
The Fed was also responsible for those really high denomination notes you hear about.
Right. Starting in 1918, the Fed issued large denomination banknotes. The $500, the $5,000, the $5,000, even a $10,000 bill. But these weren't really for public commerce. They were tools for large-scale financial transfers between banks.
And speaking of physical money, 1929 brought a big change that affects every bill we hold today. The size.
A huge change. The Treasury decided to reduce the size of all banknotes by about 30%, from the old horse blanket size to the compact size we use now. Two main reasons: to lower manufacturing costs significantly, and to standardize the features, making it easier for tellers and the public to spot counterfeits.
But that seemingly stable gold-linked system just could not survive the greatest economic shock of the 20th century, the Great Depression.
The crisis of confidence was immense. As banks failed, people started hoarding gold, and massive bank runs threatened to drain the nation's gold reserves entirely. To fight the severe deflation that was happening, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took unprecedented action in 1933.
He effectively suspended the gold standard for domestic use.
Through an executive order, yes. Roosevelt prohibited the hoarding of gold coins and gold certificates by private citizens. The goal was to force gold back into the central system, stabilize the banks, and give the Fed room to increase the money supply and reflate the economy.
Then came the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which fundamentally changed the dollar's international relationship to gold.
This act formally nationalized all the gold held by the Fed, putting it in the Treasury's hands. And crucially, Roosevelt reset the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce.
A strategic, sudden devaluation of the dollar.
Exactly. It made American goods cheaper and more competitive globally, and the U.S. ended up amassing the world's largest stock of monetary gold reserves.
So while the domestic link to gold was severed in the 30s, the dollar was about to achieve its highest global standing ever thanks to World War II.
The war left the industrial infrastructure of Europe and Asia completely decimated. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy was at peak production and held something like 70% of the world's monetary gold.
That sheer dominance was codified in the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement.
Yes. This agreement defined the entire post-war global monetary system. Other major currencies, the British pound, the German mark, were fixed to the U.S. dollar. And the U.S. dollar, in turn, was convertible to gold at that fixed rate of $35 an ounce.
So the dollar officially became the world's primary reserve currency.
It did. But the system, which was designed for stability, had a built-in time bomb. An economist at Yale named Robert Triffin first articulated it in 1960. It's known as the Triffin dilemma.
Let's break that down, because this is the key insight that leads to the modern fiat dollar.
Okay, so it's a conflict between two necessary goals. For global trade to work and grow, the U.S. needed to continuously export U.S. dollars into the world economy through trade deficits, foreign aid, to provide enough liquidity.
Okay.
But every single dollar supplied internationally represented a potential claim on the finite U.S. gold reserves held in Fort Knox. So the more dollars the U.S. supplied globally, the fewer gold reserves it held relative to the currency out there.
So if the U.S. stopped exporting dollars, global trade would seize up. But if it exported too many, international partners would lose confidence that the dollar could actually be redeemed for gold.
You've got it. It's like the U.S. had to keep lending out the keys to its own gold vault to grease global commerce, knowing that the more keys it lent out, the less trustworthy the lock in the vault became. By the late 1960s, the world had way too many dollars and not enough gold to back them.
And the confidence finally broke. Increased spending on the Vietnam War, growing trade deficits. Foreign central banks, especially France, started aggressively demanding their dollars be converted into physical gold.
And that was draining U.S. reserves dangerously. This pressure led directly to the Nixon shock. On August 15, 1971, to prevent the total depletion of U.S. gold reserves, President Nixon unilaterally issued an executive order,
Ending the dollar's direct convertibility to gold for foreign governments.
It was the final, permanent pivot. The dollar had officially become a pure fiat currency, backed only by the legal guarantee and the confidence of the U.S. government and the global market, not by any physical asset.
The end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of the age of floating exchange rates.
And it was actually preceded by a smaller but symbolically important step. In 1963, Congress officially prohibited the redemption of currency for gold, which is when they removed the phrase "payable to the bearer on demand" from newly issued Federal Reserve notes.
A phrase that was once a constitutional reassurance became a historical relic.
Exactly.
Hi, I'm Rose Emanuel,
I'm Justin Cole.
and we are launching our production company,
Give Us Mo. We are currently filming from the iconic I Love Lucy soundstage. Check out the pictures.
And maybe we can call this soundstage one of the homes for our productions.
We currently have 3 shows that we want to put through production.
One of which is called It Only Happens with Rose, and it's actually a love letter to I Love Lucy and situational comedy.
Members Only is a workplace comedy similar to The Office or Parks and Recreation that is set in a ritzy, rich country club.
And then our last project is called M, which is a prequel in the James Bond franchise, which follows Judi Dench's character when she was a spy in the 1960s.
These productions are unfortunately, but understandably not cheap.
So your support means the world to us, and you can help us get props, cast, crew, maybe even a soundstage.
Your contributions and your shares help tremendously.
We appreciate everything you guys do for us and have done for us in the past.
Absolutely. And we have some cool perks for you to check out as well.
If you believe in us, we can make our dream into a reality.
Be sure to visit giveusmoentertainment.com for more information.
Let's create some momentum. That was so cheesy, I love it. Make sure to follow along on our journey.
Thanks. A bunch.
Cheers. And that's a wrap.
Welcome back. We've traced the dollar through its turbulent history. The Nixon shock in 1971 left the U.S. government with a blank slate. So how did they invent monetary stability without that centuries-old anchor of gold? Let's analyze the modern machine, the dollar as a global fiat currency in 2025.
I think the most crucial point for everyone to grasp is that today's dollar is purely fiat money. Its value is derived entirely from the government's promise and the market's conviction that other people will accept it.
So the central challenge shifts from maintaining a gold reserve to actively managing the money supply and maintaining confidence.
Exactly. And that management task falls squarely to the Federal Reserve System, specifically the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC. And their mandate is completely different from the pre-1971 era.
Right, now it's the dual mandate, promoting maximum employment and stable prices.
To achieve this, the Fed uses its tools to influence the nation's money supply, what's known as the monetary base, or M0.
The process of how the Fed creates new money is often, I think, mysterious to the public. Can we break down the mechanics of that?
Certainly. The Fed generates M0 primarily through something called open market operations, or FOMOs. So when the Fed needs to increase the money supply, say to lower interest rates and stimulate lending, It literally creates new credit digitally in its reserve accounts
Out of thin air.
out of thin air, and uses that credit to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds from commercial banks or bond dealers.
So when the Fed buys $1 million bond from a bank, it just credits the bank's reserve account with $1 million in new money that didn't exist a second before.
Precisely. That $1 million is now part of the monetary base. And that newly injected money then enables the commercial bank to lend out a multiple of that amount through the fractional reserve banking system, which amplifies the Fed's initial injection.
The money multiplier effect.
Right. And that process of creating credit to buy assets is the core mechanism of money generation.
So where does the physical money, the paper Federal Reserve notes, fit into this digital framework?
Well, those physical notes are a liability of the Federal Reserve. They're ordered from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing based on projected demand for cash. And the actual volume of cash circulating is just astronomical. As of early 2025, the total currency in circulation was estimated at about $2.37 trillion.
That number is almost incomprehensible. And speaking of the physical notes, the ongoing arms race against sophisticated counterfeiting is a major driver of change in the design.
It really is. The dimensions have been stable since 1929, but the security features are in continuous evolution. The first modern anti-counterfeiting push really began in the 1990s.
I remember the introduction of the security threads and the microprinting, especially on the $100 bill.
Yes, those were crucial. But the really noticeable changes came with the major redesign series that started in 1996. They were trying to make the notes harder to scan or copy. They introduced things like watermarks, larger and off-center portraits to accommodate those watermarks, and color-shifting ink.
Right, the color-shifting ink, like the number 20 on the $20 bill, it shifts from copper to green when you tilt it. That's a highly effective deterrent because the ink itself is so hard to reproduce.
And the Treasury didn't stop there. After 2003, they began introducing subtle background colors, which was a response to how easily the older, purely green and black design could be replicated.
The $20 note got green and peach colors, the 50 got blue and red. And what was the pinnacle of this security evolution?
That would have to be the redesigned $100 note released in 2013. It has two major new features: the 3D security ribbon, which is woven into the paper, and the color-shifting bell in the inkwell.
These features make U.S. currency one of the most technologically secure in the world.
No question.
Before we move on to the dollar's global role, let's go back to those obsolete high-value denominations. The $500, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 notes. What's their status today?
They remain legal tender, but you'll never see one in payment because their scarcity has made them collector's items worth vastly more than their face value.
And that was the one that was never public, right?
The $100,000 gold certificate issued in 1934 with Woodrow Wilson on it, that note was strictly for interbank transfers between Federal Reserve banks. It was never legal tender for public ownership.
It's also fascinating to see how the physical currency reflects social change. The current series has a significant detail regarding who signs the notes.
Yes, the series year 2021 banknotes are historical markers. They feature the signatures of Janet Yellen, the first woman to serve as U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Chief Lynn Malerba, the first Native American to serve as U.S. Treasurer.
It's a subtle but powerful reflection of the ongoing broadening of American leadership.
It really is.
Now, let's tackle the dollar's sheer international weight. Why is this currency, backed only by confidence, still the undisputed pillar of global finance?
It's really the legacy of Bretton Woods and the fact that the post-1971 system never created a true challenger. The USD is still the most widely used currency in international transactions, the most exchanged currency globally. Central banks worldwide hold massive dollar reserves, mostly as U.S. Treasury bonds.
This global dependence grants the United States what was famously termed the exorbitant privilege. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
It means the U.S. can finance its massive public debt by issuing bonds in its own currency. Because the world constantly needs dollars for trade, central banks and foreign investors have to buy those bonds.
So it guarantees the U.S. can borrow heavily from global markets at minimal interest rates, a luxury no other nation really has.
It's an effective subsidy granted by the rest of the world. And it's often reinforced by other geopolitical factors, like the petrodollar system, which mandates that most international oil trades be denominated in USD, creating this perpetual global demand.
And beyond trade, the dollar's influence is seen in two other forms of reliance: dollarization and currency pegs.
Let's start with dollarization. That's nations that have just adopted the USD as their official currency.
Like Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama.
Right? They use the US dollar, sometimes printing their own small coins, but they rely entirely on US monetary policy for stability. And then you have countries facing hyperinflation, like Venezuela or Zimbabwe, where the dollar is widely accepted unofficially as a secondary currency.
And then there are the currency pegs, where nations fix their local currency's value directly to the dollar.
This is very common in oil-producing nations, like the Saudi rial and also the Hong Kong dollar. They keep a fixed exchange rate to the USD, linking their economic stability directly to the decisions made by the Federal Reserve in Washington.
This huge network ensures the dollar's status is just deeply entrenched. This incredible global utility and volume, they anchor the dollar's relevance, but they also mask a crucial reality for us here at home: the continuous long-term erosion of the dollar's purchasing power under this fiat system.
The long-term cost is startling when you look at it historically. Our sources indicate that the US dollar lost about 97% of its buying power from 1774 through 2012. That continuous decline is the price we pay for stability and liquidity.
And the end of the gold link really shows its starkest effect here, doesn't it? Where was the most aggressive, rapid decline in value?
It happened immediately after the gold standard was permanently severed. The dollar lost two-thirds of its value between 1965 and 1981. This massive inflation spike was driven by the Fed's policy at the time, which basically saw inflation as a benign side effect of full employment.
So they just kept increasing the money supply.
They did, fueling a vicious inflationary cycle. And it took dramatic policy intervention to stop that bleeding, specifically the tightening of the money supply by Fed Chairman Paul Volcker in the late 70s and early 80s.
A painful recessionary period.
Very painful, but it successfully stabilized the dollar and established the modern management framework. Since the 1980s, the Fed's strategy has been to target a low, stable rate of inflation, usually between 2 and 3.5%.
So we have an explicit policy trade-off. The dollar is managed to lose value continuously, just slowly.
Exactly. Even under this modern, stabilized management, the dollar lost over half its value between 1981 and 2009. This continuous decline is a deliberate and accepted trade-off in modern monetary policy. It incentivizes people to spend rather than hoard, keeping the economy moving.
Beyond the economics, the dollar is constantly evolving physically to meet new demands. We're seeing major plan changes based on accessibility needs.
This is the result of a 2008 lawsuit filed by the American Council of the Blind. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing has accepted the mandate to improve the physical usability of the currency for visually impaired individuals.
What specific changes are coming?
We should see several new features: larger, higher contrast numerals that are easier to distinguish, and new raised tactile features that will allow users to instantly differentiate between denominations by feel.
Similar to systems already in place on Canadian and Euro notes.
Exactly. And beyond accessibility, the announced redesigns are deeply symbolic, reflecting these changing historical perspectives on who should represent the nation on its currency.
The most high-profile one involves the $20 bill.
Right. Andrew Jackson, the architect of the bank war, is slated to move to the back. And Harriet Tubman, the abolitionist and humanitarian, will appear prominently on the front. That's a profound shift.
And the change isn't isolated, is it? It extends to other denominations, specifically honoring the women's suffrage movement.
The $10 bill is scheduled to keep Alexander Hamilton on the front, but the back will be completely redesigned to feature figures like Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and others against a backdrop of the 1913 Women's Suffrage March.
And the $5 bill's back is also slated for a redesign to showcase historical events at the Lincoln Memorial.
Featuring figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Mary Ann Anderson, and Eleanor Roosevelt. These redesigns are really transforming the currency into a more comprehensive canvas of American history.
And finally, we should probably mention the quiet end of America's smallest coin.
The penny.
The penny.
Our sources confirmed that the U.S. Mint halted production of the circulating 1-cent coin in 2025. It's still legal tender, but production is stopped because its metal content and manufacturing cost more than its face value.
So what does all this mean for the dollar's status moving forward?
Well, we've journeyed with the dollar from being a stand-in for a Spanish silver coin, through the Continental collapse, the bank wars, to the emergence of the Civil War greenbacks.
Yeah.
We saw the gold standard fail under its own internal contradiction, the Triffin dilemma, and we've arrived at this modern system.
A global fiat reserve currency whose value is determined not by metal, but by active management from the Federal Reserve focused on confidence and low inflation.
The sheer volume of USD circulating globally, that $2.37 trillion, ensures its continued relevance. It anchors its status. However, the planned physical redesigns and the long-term reality of losing purchasing power demonstrate that the dollar, despite its global status, is a constantly evolving entity.
Adapting to technological, security, and massive social demands.
The key takeaway is this. The dollar you hold today is managed under a deliberate policy that trades rapid, crisis-driven instability for a continuous, slow erosion of value. The long-term challenge for the Fed isn't just managing the money supply, it's managing global confidence in a purely abstract asset, while also justifying the political and social costs of its exorbitant privilege.
And that complex balance is what will define the dollar's trajectory in the decades to come.
I think so.
Thanks for listening, and let us know in the comments where you think the dollar is going.